Welcome to the Don Watkins Show. I'm your host, Don Watkins. And let's see. So, today on the agenda, I want to dig into a book that I read last week, The Power of the Dog by Don Winslow. And I mean, it was really fantastic. If you like the show The Wire or Narcos, uh, if you like really great crime fiction, I think you'll like this book, but I'm going to focus on it mainly from what I learned in terms of writing. So I think there's a lot of really cool lessons, even if you haven't read the book, even if you never want to read the book, even if it's not your genre. There's some really cool stuff here. Um, One thing though I did want to talk about. So this is a tactic or an issue that's come up with a lot of people that I've worked with, and it's an issue of outlining. So I'm a big fan of outlining, but with a giant caveat. So the way that I used to teach outlining and was that all right, there's this writing process, and basically there's steps that you have to go through in order to produce something that is clear, something that is logical, something that is persuasive. And it started with thinking, that is getting your idea straight so you knew what you wanted to communicate. Then you would outline to give it structure and logical precision. Then you would draft based on your outline, and then you would edit. And one of the things I realized was that intellectually people would agree with this advice and yet find it really hard to follow. And my general view is that if you think like, "Oh man, I have such great advice and nobody will follow it," the problem is not with the people, the problem is with the advice. And then I stepped back and thought, "Jesus, Watkins, I don't follow this." That's not 100% true. There are a lot of cases where that is my process, but very often it's not. And what I came to see is to stop thinking about a writing process and start thinking about writing tools. That is, you need a toolkit and you need to know what the tools are for, and you need to have those tools at your disposal. But they're just tools, and you're not slaves to tools. So, for instance, I mean, if you can sit down and bat out something that's like perfect and you're totally happy with it, then you don't need any process. Just go ahead and do that. But if you can't, if you're not getting the result, and I think in most cases you're not going to get the results you want doing that, then it's okay. I need other tools in my toolkit. Instead of just going and trying to write out something perfect, I need to kind of break down a certain kind of process. And I think a big aspect of when to use which tool is based on motivation. So much about writing is motivation. It's I'm inspired to put in the work, so I'm going to sit down and put in the work. And so what I often advise people, because what usually happens is that there's people who for them writing is about that joy of sitting down and just blurting out something, forming their ideas on the page, creating something, and it has a certain kind of electric living feeling to it. And the idea that, like, no, you're not allowed to do that until you outline, until you do all these other things, I think is totally wrong. But outlines are crucial tools. And so, what I've tried to stress with my clients from now in recent months is to view it as a tool. And so, what is the tool for? Well, an outline is for you to be able to get a bird's eye view of the structure and logic of your piece. It's to be able to see, okay, this point leads to this point, leads to this point, leads to this point, and it all adds up to my conclusion or my theme. And so there's really kind of two major ways that you can use an outline. One is at the beginning, before you draft, to work out, yeah, this is the structure I'm going to try to execute on. And that's fine. I mean, there's a lot that's going for that. But another approach can be, look, you sit down, write from inspiration, see where it will lead, but then at that point, step back from the piece, and when you start your editing, the first thing you should do is outline. And you can either in effect, treat your rough draft as something to be set aside, and then you kind of outline just off the top of your head. You can also do what is called reverse outlining, which is identify what is the actual structure of what I blurted out, and then edit that outline, get it to where you want to be, and then you can edit your draft towards that. So, an outline is indispensable because it allows you to hold in your mind the structure of a piece and see how it fits together and see what it adds up to, if anything. And that is hugely, hugely valuable, particularly for anything that's beyond, let's call it 500 words, 800 words, 1,000 words at most, that you can't hold the whole structure in mind at once. You can't think about it as a whole piece unless you're able to boil it down to a few key points. But the basic idea here is don't become a slave to your outline. Use it as a tool to help you turn out the kind of writing that you want. So I spent most of this week on the book Self-Made Manifesto, which we've talked about the first 2 weeks, working on the final section. We talked about that in detail last week. That's the section on nurturing your soul. So I don't have too much to say about that. It's going well. I'm pretty confident I will have a fully uh, complete rough draft of every chapter in the book at the end of next week. And then we'll really start. The early chapters I've edited quite a bit. The later chapters are very messy. And so I'll probably start going through it. I'll be doing a lot of reverse outlining to make sure the structure is awesome. So we'll probably have a lot more to say about the book starting next week. But in the meantime, I've also been spending a lot of time preparing for and thinking about my next novel. And so one of the things I'm doing that I think I mentioned last week is reading a lot more fiction and fiction in my genre. And the book I read last week is Don Winslow's The Power of the Dog, which it's part of a three-part trilogy, which I guess is redundant, on the rise of the Mexican drug cartels. But it's all fictionalized. So if you've seen Narcos, that's kind of like a semi-fictionalized or semi-real version of what actually happened. This takes the the many of the key events in that story and totally fictionalizes them. That it's real events but changed around and rearranged and told through the eyes of fictional characters. And it really is incredible. In part, the plots are well constructed, the characters are really compelling, and the realism is in many ways unmatched, certainly in the crime genre. That is, aside from the fact that you're seeing through the eyes of the characters, you think, yeah, this resonates. Like this has the feel of like somebody who's captured reality, and yet he's kept the drama, the compelling, tension-filled, emotion-filled storytelling that makes this unique and unequaled in journalism. And journalists have written amazing books on this subject, but this really brings you inside the minds and souls of the people in this world. And, it's just if you like this kind of writing, it's a compelling read. But my goal here is not to pitch you on the book per se. It is to talk about some of the things that I've learned from Winslow or ideas I've gotten from Winslow, both from reading the book, but also I became just really fascinated with how he approaches writing. And so did a study on that. So let's dive in with a few of the insights that have come out. So, one really interesting thing is this is true of Winslow. It's actually true of a lot of the crime writers that I really respect. Is that he doesn't outline, like he does not plan out his stories ahead. It's not that he has no ideas about where it's going. And certainly for this trilogy in particular, I imagine that given that he was steeped in the events that had actually taken place in terms of the rise of the drug cartels. He had things in his mind, but he sits down and writes and tells the story. And in part, the argument that he made for why he doesn't do that is the idea that he thinks if he had an outline, he'd be a slave to the outline. And if you've ever written fiction or tried to write fiction, one of the things that you'll notice is that there's a real discovery process that happens. That as you're creating, characters, events, ideas pop up that you could not have anticipated if you're just sitting down and blocking out things, blocking out scenes at the beginning. And he wants the freedom to kind of follow those threads. And I mean, to me, what was shocking in not just my latest novel, but even the ones that didn't work out was how often you would just throw something out there in the page for a scene and you'd realize 10 scenes down the road, "Oh my gosh, I can cash in on that in a really cool way." That is, it's fascinating how much you can kind of integrate your work as you go along and kind of pull things together and build this kind of coherent, cohesive plot and story without having it pre-planned. Now, you can roughly divide writers up into 3 categories. One is, like, kind of no planning at all, and that's sort of like how, um, Stephen King describes his process, how, oh, I as I said last week, I always forget his, name, but the author of the Jack Reacher books. Gosh, I don't know why, I can never remember that. Um, but they just kind of, like, dive in and go piece by piece and totally exploratory, just like, "Let's see where this goes." And then on the other extreme, there's writers like Jeffrey Deaver who, like, they have a detailed outline to the point where when they're writing, they're just really kind of like, um, painting the picture. So it's, I know exactly what's gonna happen in this scene, and that scene, and that scene, and that scene, and that scene, and how it's all gonna fit together and all the major turning points. I just have to actually now write it. And then I think there's a lot of people who are in the middle, and I'm certainly in the middle where I have to have some sense of where I'm going. And I think we'll see if that lasts, if that persists, because the more that you kind of, particularly if you're writing in a genre, the more that you internalize structure and have a sense of pacing, have a sense of how to Lee Child, thank you, Jose. The more you have a sense of, like, how to have a story that's kind of has motion and is driving towards an end point, I think the more that you can do things at an intuitive, unplanned level. But I have to have a sense of where I'm going, and so, I have what I think about it as, like, this isn't exactly what I do, but it's pretty close. Alright, here's my key scenes. And some of the scenes I have pretty specific ideas for what I'm gonna do with them. Some of them I have sort of like vague ideas, like these characters meet, and then kind of write towards that. And what I'll usually end up doing is outlining in more detail, like 3 to 5 scenes ahead of where I am as things progress. But part of it comes from just like, all right, I get to know the characters. I get to like throw things out there where I'm drafting and let those lead me in a new direction. And so I found it interesting that Winslow doesn't outline, but what he does do, and this was really, I've never heard another writer talk about it in this way. So he makes the point that he does 10 to 15 drafts, and it might have been 15 to 20, but I think he said 10 to 15 drafts that are going to go towards a novel. And he says that at the start, he's not thinking about his audience at all. At the start, all he's trying to do is have fun and amuse himself, and get lost in the work to have fun creating. And it's only in the last, I don't remember if he gave a number, but let's call it 4 or 5 drafts that he's thinking about the audience. And at that point, he's only thinking about the audience, about their clarity, their experience. And so, for example, in The Power of the Dog, so this book is roughly 530 pages. And he said that his first draft of that was something like 2,000 pages. And so, I mean, he cut, 3 extra books from this. But in order to create that book, he first had to like build it himself. And so, this is one of the consequences of if you're going to be a more exploratory writer, you're very likely going to overwrite. You're very likely going to have to do more editing. So if like you cringe at the thought of editing, then like maybe try to do more on the front end. I have mixed feelings. I love the first few major edits to a book. Once you've overhauled it 5 or 6 times, then it starts becoming a little overwhelming, at least to me. But uh, yeah, this kind of idea of I'm writing for me at the beginning, and then I'm writing for the reader at the end, I found really fascinating. And it's not something I've heard others talk about, but I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me. And I might give it a try with my next novel. One of the other things that was really, really cool, which is I noticed this very early on in the book. Let's see if I think I even have a note here. Well, it doesn't matter if I have the note because I'm not going to give you any spoilers anyway. But uh, he does something that, by the current rules, you are not supposed to do. And that comes under the umbrella of point of view. So, point of view, you can think of in simple terms like first person, third person. Um, but what one of the cardinal sins today, not historically, but in kind of modern genre writing, is that you're not to engage in head hopping. That is within a scene. Sometimes people will take this to not even within a chapter, but certainly not within a scene. You're not supposed to change the point of view from one character to another. You're not supposed to be able to see inside the head of one character and then a few paragraphs later leap to another. That's just one of those rules, one of those dogmas. And Winslow does this, and it was funny. He was asked about this. And he said, one of my friends was saying, like, hey, you're changing point of view in the space of a few paragraphs. And he said, damn it, if I could change point of view within the space of a single word, I would. And his reasoning, and he didn't fully spell it out, but what he said was readers are smart if you treat them as intelligent. And so the idea is like, look, I'm trying to tell a story, and there's interesting things to be explored in one person's head or another. And it's not like the reader's completely baffled if you're a good writer when we go from the perspective of one character to another very quickly. Um, I mean, again, you you notice it, but I'll just put it this way: I'm really glad that he did it. It really helped um, bring out and create a certain kind of feel to the book and certain kind of insights and certain kind of humor that you couldn't have had anyway. Um, and so I take this to mean not that everybody like it's not an issue of throwing out point of view, but it's there are no rules. There's only a purpose and your effectiveness at executing it. And what Winslow gets is that given his purposes, then he needed to go wherever as the narrator, wherever the story wanted him to go. And readers can follow that. Like I was not sitting around baffled by those changes. So I take the wider view to be don't be bound by rules, try to formulate principles and be attentive to context. So another thing that I think might be of particular interest to this group. So Winslow is an opponent, as I assume many in my audience are, of the drug war. And his book is really making that point. It's making that case. Now, it is not preachy. And part of what makes it so effective is that this is a book that's story first, character first, bringing you into a world, keeping you on the edge of your seat, not letting you put it down, but it's making a point. And so the question is, how do you make a point in a novel? Well, it's not by characters sitting around and pontificating and arguing. And Winslow, this is not the only way to do it, and I'll come back to other ways in a second. Winslow uses, I think, one of the best methods for making a point, which is his main character starts out with one view of the drug war and through the events of the novel comes to see the drug war in a completely different light. And so it's the changing of the character's mind that is going to allow you to look at the issue in a new light. And this is very in alignment with something that Alex at Epstein and I teach when we teach how to be persuasive on energy issues. It's a concept that Alex calls um, a uh, well, I'm going blank on it for some reason, but it's the idea that you have your kind of like um, personal narrative of how you came to an issue, and it's the idea that you're going to tell the story of how you came to believe something, and that story, assuming that you're an objective thinker, is going to show how you went through an objective process of thinking that led you to the conclusion that you have now. And the what Winslow is doing in fiction is the same thing. It's we're encountering the kinds of events, facts that are, if analyzed properly, are going to lead someone from saying, "Yeah, this is great. Drugs are bad. Let's stop them," to saying the drug war is completely immoral, hopeless, and destructive. And so if you're thinking about like how do I make an ideological point in a book, having a character change their view, but change their view through the events of the novel, like that's the evidence that leads them to change their view. That is one, I think, really powerful way to do it. And for my audience, a good parallel here is Ayn Rand. She often makes points this way. So, I mean, for example, we have Reardon's transformation from a certain view of morality to a different one. We have Dagny's transformation from a certain view of evil to a different view of evil through the events of the novel. Anthem is probably the purest example of this, where we have somebody who it's not exactly that accepts the collectivism that he's born into. Um, but he doesn't quite know how to question it. And we see the steps that he goes through to reach a very different view of the individual. And I bring up the parallel to Rand because I also want to just note in passing, this probably is something we should analyze in more detail at some point. There's other ways to do it. So, one major way is contrasting characters. And then we see where those contrasting approaches lead. So, for example, if you're trying to show individualism versus collectivism, not in politics, but in men's soul, one thing is you can show somebody going from being a collectivist to becoming an individualist. But the other thing you can do is you can show an individualist and his trajectory, and then collectivists and their trajectories. And then that'll lead you to a certain conclusion about what does this approach to life lead to? And what does the other approach to life lead to? And that's what we get in the Fountainhead. So um, how to use a story to make a larger point, I think, is a really fascinating topic, and it's great to study people like Rand and like Winslow, because what you don't want to do is sacrifice story, sacrifice the reader's enjoyment for the sake of making a point. What you want is a gripping, can't put it down novel with unforgettable characters and deep emotion that also leaves them with something more to think about. Now I try to do that in my own novel. We'll see, what people think of it when it comes out, which, by the way, I talked to my publisher today, I got some updates. So it should be available to review for those of you who got early copies on Goodreads, I think roughly a month from now, something like that, maybe a little less than that. It'll be up on Amazon sometime before it's published, but you won't be able to leave reviews there until the publication date. But anyway, much more to come on that. But just wanted to mention that everything is moving forward with that. In fact, I have to make a quick note that I'm supposed to get the final cover for my book soon. All right. So, what next? Well, one interesting thing about his process, and I'm very, very tempted to at least try this route, though I'm a little bit afraid of it. Is he says Winslow says that he works on two books at a time in general. And the idea is that one is he's researching and one he's actually writing. And in other places I've heard him talk about, like when he gets stuck with one, he'll go to the other. And I have not tried that, but I'm quite tempted to, in part because um, I'm really excited to make some progress on the novel, the next novel in the series. Uh, but on the other hand, there's part of me that my best strategy for writing books is to just like be super excited about them and try to get them done as quickly as possible just because I'm so enthused and so focused on them. So I have not decided if I'm going to do that. Although, I mean, you could argue I am already, right? Like I'm doing some thinking and researching for the novel while I'm working on the self made manifesto. But it's an interesting idea of kind of like swapping projects. Cause I mean, like, look, in my ideal world, I'm not going to be able to pull this off in the next year because I have so many other projects on my plate. But in my ideal world, I'd be coming out with one nonfiction and one fiction book a year. I think that fits my interests and it fits my general pacing. Um, so at some point I might get there, but I'm at least putting that on the table. And let's put it in kind of a wider perspective. The cool thing about being a writer is kind of like experimenting with how you like to write, how you like to create, and that there are no there's no preset rules about how many books to write at once and what ways to go about it. So right now I kind of feel like I'm in the space of creatively searching for my favorite mode of creation. One of the things that Winslow talks about that I was really interested in, I am very interested in people's process, but particularly somebody like him who's so research heavy. Like clearly this guy has real insight into the worlds that he's describing. And the question is, well, how do you get that? And so his research process consists of the way he puts it is kind of starting big and getting small. And, or to put it differently, starting wide and getting really narrow. So his background's as a historian, and it's okay. Let me just research the history of Mexico, right? Let me look kind of like the history side of things. And then you start looking at things like documents and then, newspaper stories, blogs that are giving you the blow by blow of the Mexican cartel wars and so on. And then finally, personal conversations and interviews. And that's always like, oh man, I know I would be able to write much better if I was able to spend like, a bunch of time talking to cops or hanging out with the FBI and getting all the inside information. And look, it's true. I mean, like if you're going to write something on the cartel wars that's going to have really the feel of something real, then going down to Mexico and spending time talking to the cops and the criminals down there. I mean, that's really valuable if you can do it. Now, remember, he didn't do this on his first book. Um, And so there is a kind of, if you're really looking to be grounded in that realism, pick something closer to home, which is one of the reasons that my first book is not like, I did not pick a character who's like ex CIA or something, because until I get to know a few CIA agents, I'm not going to be able to really make that real. And it's not even just an issue of realism. And I'm going to come to my view of realism, or my approach to realism, later. But it's even to the extent that you don't have firsthand knowledge of reality, what you write will then, by necessity, be more derivative than you might want it to be, right? Because it's, well, what do I know about the CIA or the FBI? Well, I guess it's what I seen on TV and read in other people's books. And one of the things Winslow said is that he deliberately doesn't watch things like the show Narcos. Um, I forget the other examples he gave, but not because he doesn't think these things would be good. Sicario, the movie, not because he doesn't think these things will be good, but because he doesn't want it influencing what he says. He wants it to all come from his own research, his own way of looking at things. And so, I'm going to say a word about how he interviews in a second, but Jose has a question. What do you think about the Ayn Rand idea that one can write about the essence of war from studying a street fight? Well, I think that is certainly true, because what she's getting at is, it's the emotional reality of it that the writer is able to project. And there's no question you can do that. Indeed, that's a very eloquent way of capturing why a an author of fiction has the power to really bring us into the minds and souls of all kinds of people, many like who are not them, lives that they've never led, thoughts that they've never had. And it really can be boiled down to the same kind of mental process that goes from studying a street fight and getting the nature of war. And but the emotional reality, one of the best ways to be able to put the reader in that reality is with the sort of telling details that one would only know if one was in that reality. So, yes, you can get to the essence of war by studying a street fight. But, you know, the if you listen to the stories in documentaries of soldiers who are actually in war, one of the things, and actually this is a tactic Winslow uses quite a bit. One of the interesting things is how, in these kind of larger than life and death circumstances, how often a person's mind can be focused on something really trivial. Like, bullets are whizzing by me and I can't help notice that, my buddy's fly's unzipped. Like that kind of thing. And if you talk to people and you become embedded in, the world of your story in a real kind of almost journalistic way, it's much easier to find those telling details. And so, as we'll come to, my point is not that you're not allowed to write unless you become like a journalist who can engage in ultra realism. But I admire that kind of writing. And though I don't want to be exactly that kind of writer, and I'll talk about why soon, um, there's a lot that I gain from that, and I want to emulate from that. And so I certainly admire people who can pull it off so well. Jose's follow-up says, I wonder about that kind of process where a writer can do that readily and presumably not depend on research and experience. Well, I don't know. I mean, there's no writer who doesn't depend on research and experience, but I take you to mean like not firsthand experience in some concrete area. But even if you take somebody like Ayn Rand, who was, like the arch romanticist, she did a lot of research for her novels. I mean, for The Fountainhead, she went and worked in an architect's office and read, gazillion books on architecture and so on in We the Living, of course, it was all reflecting, 2 decades and more, 2.5 decades of experience living in Soviet Russia. And in Atlas Shrugged, though she didn't have to do as much detailed research as for The Fountainhead because it was kind of spanning across different industries, she still spent a lot of time, I believe years, uh, doing that kind of research because, like, you need to have enough reality to ground people in, even if you're creating a fantasy world. And Jim says a novel with contrast is necessary, but a novel written in a setting of rational egoism dominating a culture, but with contrasting whiffs of growing irrationality is a novel I'm ready for next. Yeah, that's a really interesting. I mean, I take your point to be this in effect. Uh, oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, that's a kind of setting that nobody has explored, right? I mean, look, well, no, I guess I was gonna say the Fountainhead is sort of like that. I mean, the Fountainhead collectivism is dominating, but not in the way that it is in Atlas. But no, I think look, there's so many things to explore with fiction, but particularly with kind of objectivist ideas. I'm doing something a little bit different. Um, I mean, in part, I'm writing genre fiction, so it at least for now, philosophic ideas are there, but they're not at the core of the theme of the book. Um, but I'm very interested in kind of what could you do philosophically that was fully grounded in today's reality? And we'll see where that leads. But that's just an open question in my mind. Um, well, I keep making reference to this idea that I'm going to talk about realism and how I think about realism. So, Winslow's view is that his role as a writer, what he wants to do, his mission, is he wants to take you inside a world that you probably won't get to visit, a real world. So it's in effect, you could read journalistic stories and they would be really interesting, but he's going to take you fully inside the world, inside the minds and souls of the people inhabiting this world. But it's the real world, and that's his whole mission. Now he wants to do it in a way that's gripping and dramatic and, keeps you turning the pages and on the edge of your seat. But, if you think of like Ayn Rand describing the goal of her writing as the depiction of the ideal man, his is the depiction of a real world that is not easy to get inside. And like that's a legitimate literary goal. And uh, that is not my goal, but nor is my way of coming at things Ayn Rand's, where there's a grounding in reality and certainly in the metaphysical nature of man and the actual values and virtues required for his happiness. Um, but she was most at home in a world that was fully self created by her, and indeed thought that Atlas Shrugged was much more her kind of novel than The Fountainhead, because The Fountainhead still was connected to historic reality. Um, and I view myself as somewhere in the middle. That is, I want the kind of plot that you get romanticism, but I want to really, really feel like, yeah, I've seen people, at, and places like it should have the feel of like, yeah, this could really happen in life as I live it today. And I don't know exactly what to analogize it to, except for maybe like I would love The Wire, but with more heroic characters and maybe faster pacing, something like that. Um, and so Winslow is a good anchor for me on the reality side. I believe me, I have more than enough inspiration on the romanticist side. Uh, but this kind of grounding in the kind of detailed understanding of reality. I mean, down to the point of like, all right, this is yes, this is the kind of When I say grounded in reality, again, I want to stress I'm not talking about like metaphysical or philosophical truths about reality. Like no good writers abandoning those. But I mean things like this. Um, what kind of clothes is a person who's a um narco in Mexico going to be wearing during the late 1990s? What kind of gun are they going to be carrying? What kind of house and what locations? And how are they going to, view a character cheating on their wife in that culture? Like, how are they going to use certain words and certain language? And that's the kind of reality that I mean. So again, the more journalistic kind. Jose says, "Have you seen *Halt and Catch Fire* related to ingenuism?" Yeah, I really like that, particularly the first season. I watched the whole thing, and I can't give you kind of like a full review off the top of my head because it's been years since I've seen it. But I thought they did a good job, particularly in the first season, of highly dramatic and really realistic about this is what it's like to start a company and so on. I think it became a part of what it was fascinating is most of the drama came from the creating of a company in the first season. I think it got more dragged into um the kind of drama of the characters later, which was fine, but it's just not what was so marvelous about the first season. Um and you realize that because they were kind of hanging on to the realism, this company was never going to succeed that much because that's not, they're not the people who succeeded in the real world. So that kind of undercut it a little bit. So there are these challenges you face about, well, how much am I holding on to what really happened and how much am I not? And does that limit me? Does it open things up? So anyway, those are just some words about how I'm thinking about realism right now. And let's see if there's anything else that I want to talk about. Oh well, I'll raise this because just this will be potentially interesting to people. I saw a Twitter thread that kind of took off a week or two ago, where basically it was a debate over have there ever been any good sex scenes in books? And I frankly had real trouble coming up with them. Um, and or maybe they weren't even saying books, but movies. Movies is a different thing. But certainly in books, and I think that was part of the discussion. And I should say Winslow's are quite explicit, but they also, for oddly enough, like they all to me felt justified and worked really well, and none of them felt cringy. And I don't have off the top of my head exactly why and how it's different from other books that I've read, where it does feel either like excessive or unnecessary or cringy. But in his, it that they really, I thought, worked with the characters. It was like how the characters would really talk and react. And so I was just impressed with that because it's a really hard thing to do well as a writer, as illustrated by the fact that people think it's a debatable question whether these should even exist in books. Um, but yeah, so those are the lessons I learned from Don Winslow. I am now just getting started on the second book in the trilogy, The Cartel. Eager to finish the whole trilogy in the next few weeks. And hopefully come away with a lot of other lessons. And there were a ton of other lessons, but if I was going to share them with you, I'd be having to like give a whole bunch of plot spoilers, and I certainly don't want to do that. But he just has a magnificent sense of how to tell a story and bring you into a world and make you care about characters. That's let me add that as one thing. With I don't think it'll be a plot spoiler to say this. If you do read the book, notice what he's doing to make you care about the characters because you can definitely see it if you're looking for it. because a lot of these characters are bad people, are mixed people, and there's some of those mixed people in particular. I don't take him as an egalitarian who's like, well, there's no difference between the bad guys and the good guys. No, but he has a lot of these characters who kind of you could think they have some bad parts and some good parts, and he wants some of those he wants you to really sympathize with, and you can see how he's doing it, and it's very excellently done. Indeed, if you're not looking for it, you certainly won't see it, but it still will have the impact that he wants. But if you want to learn characterization, that's one important thing to see is how do you create characters and ensure that the reader views them the way that you want them to be viewed. Let's see. Jose, did you want to be any of the characters by the time it ended? I take that to be directed at me reading these books. Um, no, but I don't. I didn't have that expectation. I mean, I just don't have that expectation generally in the thriller genre. Um, in part, it depends on how literally you're taking it, right? Like, there's certainly characters who exhibit certain virtues, but like, do I want to fight bad guys? I mean, I guess you could say, like, reading Jack Reacher, I would not in another life, could I see myself, if I was, like, strong and fast and, not interested in philosophy, like, would I go out and, live that kind of life? I mean, maybe that's plausible or like, Robert Parker Spencer. But that's not how I valid. I think about it much more not in terms of emulation in the thriller genre. I think about it more as like friendulation, which obviously isn't a word, but we'll make it a word. And that's like, are these people that I would love to hang out with and get to know? So, the like, yeah, I want to be like Rourke and Francisco. Um, do I want to be like Javert in Les Miserables? No, but man, I would love to get to know him. And I have a similar attitude towards the best characters in a thriller novel. And I mean, part of it is not even like emulation or friendulation. I'm just really interested in human psychology. And so even if the characters are really bad, if I think that the author actually is able to get the way that these people think and are motivated in a genuine way that resonates, I'm interested in that. It's not my favorite. So we're not talking about like my favorite literature, which uh is going to be much more like life as it might be and ought to be. But there's other values that I think literature can provide, and some of it is just like the thrill and excitement, um, surprising originality, and some of it for me is a sneak peek into the minds and lives of people that I want to understand. I mean, you can take Dostoevsky as like the ultimate example of somebody who does this. But I think on a lower level, a lesser level, but still a valuable level, are a lot of thriller writers. I mean, this is one of the reasons I am a fan of Stephen King. I think I might have said this before, but I really admire him actually in the same way I like reading Tolstoy. Except for Stephen King has the benefit of also being a page turner, in which I don't find Tolstoy this way. But in the sense of he's a super perceptive observer of human life. And I love being with somebody, spending time with somebody who's a perceptive observer of human beings and human behavior and human psychology and human emotion and not my sense of life. Uh, I'm, not the I'm not reading it for inspiration or uplift, but I'm getting a real value out of it. And so again, I'm not equating. I think you can make, I think there's better and worse things that can be achieved in literature. And certainly, like, the highest thing is when you can give people a hero to emulate and, portray life at its best. But that's not the only legitimate artistic endeavor. And particularly in a world where we don't have a lot of great art along those lines, you can still get a lot out of things that are trying to accomplish something else. So let's see. I have a couple questions that were sent in, and uh, feel free to ask some questions in the queue, and then we'll close it up for this week. So Gustavo asks, "What do you think of Michael Humer?" So Michael Humer is a philosopher. I think at the University of Colorado in Boulder, but I might be getting that wrong. But anyway, he's a philosophy professor, and he's knowledgeable about objectivism, at least for a professional philosopher, and has written some influential books in the libertarian anarchism space. No, my view is that he's it's nice that he's thinks that objectivism and Ayn Rand are worthy of being kind of understood and argued about. I don't think he understands it. I think his own methodology is ultra rationalistic. I think his uh, arguments for anarchism are really bad and reflect, I think, a really bad methodology. I recommend if somebody's interested, he has an exchange in the Ayn Rand Society book on politics. That the exchange is really good. I forget everybody who replies in it, but look for looking that up if you're interested in humor. He wrote one or two things that were like supposedly takedowns of objectivism, and you probably can find them online. But I mean, look, it's at the end of the day, it's a slightly more sophisticated version of the same thing, which is uh, I would put it for him unintentional straw men for the most part, and if not unintentional straw men, just bad counter arguments that come from a really rationalistic place. So, like, I don't think he's a villain, but I don't think there's that much to learn from him. So I got two questions from David. I don't know that I have things to say in both of them, but these are responses to a point to points that I made in my newsletter on Thursday. Well, I guess they would have had to been earlier in the for a Twitter thread that I think I published. In any case, at some point I got these questions. So David quotes me: "We overcomplicate success. It really comes down to two things: learn how to help people and learn how to make them aware that you can help them." And he says, "This seems to solely put success in the realm of relationships to others. If I cannot help people, can I not be successful? Should learning how to help them be the priority? I don't think that was the concern for Rand's heroes, for example." Well, it certainly is not an issue of putting relationships with others first or anything like that. What I'm really talking about is the division of labor. What is the division of labor? It's that you're creating values, but it's values that are valued by other people. It's that they want these things to achieve their goals, to solve their problems. And if other people don't value what you're creating, if it's not helping them, then it's not an economic value. You can't offer it in trade. You can't get anywhere. And so, in many ways, all I'm saying is that success comes down to having something to offer in the division of labor that people want. Or, as I put it, it's to learn how to help people. And should learning how to help them be a priority? I don't think that was a concern for Rand's heroes, for example. Well, it depends on what you mean. I think it certainly was the concern of Rand's heroes in the sense that I am talking about, which is that had a view of this is the kind of human habitation that achieves certain purposes. Reardon had a view of this is a metal that's going to create all kinds of products that are going to be great for human life. Dagny was running a railroad to help you get to where you wanted to go, and as cost effectively as possible in a way that she profited from and you profited from. So I think all of the characters are doing precisely this. I mean, it doesn't mean being the idea of being focused on helping people doesn't mean being obsequious. It doesn't mean I'll create whatever you want me to create. No, there is the issue of so I'm talking about like, well, what is the key to success? Um Obviously it's creating things that you regard as good, things that you regard as values, you independently. But it's that their values to other human beings to achieve their goals in the world. And so I just don't think there's a dichotomy between the kind of independence and the focus on creating things that you think are good and worthwhile and helping others. But I find the helping others perspective. So let me put it differently. If I'm writing for non-objectivists, I might say this, but I wouldn't necessarily stress it in the same way. The issue of helping others. But look, we get the independence part, we get the selfish part, we get the career that you love part. But what makes you successful? What's that other people value that? And again, it's not catering to whatever they value. Part of what you can do is you can teach them what they should value. That's what Rourke does. He creates something that people don't know that they want and then waits for his ideal customer to find him. But he's still creating things that help people. And so, yeah, I would put it that way. Is it's essentially a statement of the division of labor. And then he quotes me again. Mentors can supercharge your progress, but they can also hold you back. At some point, you have to stop trying to be like them and start doubling down on what's uniquely you. Don't do it too early or too late, and you'll be just fine. And then he says, it would be great if there was some guidance on noticing signs of too early or too late. What's the balance between myself and my mentor? And how can I actually know when it is time to move forward? Otherwise, I can be trapped in indecision. And I mean, it's a fair question. And indeed, I took my comment to be a little tongue in cheek. Like, okay, Watkins, that's great. So how do I know that? It's exactly the kind of question I want to provoke. And I really don't have a great answer here, except to say that almost always the mistake is probably people kind of like breaking away and pioneering out on their own too late. Um, and I mean, I say this because certainly that's the error I committed. So maybe I'm a little bit biased in it. But no, my view is that you want to uh, learn what you can from others as quickly as possible. But the moment you're ready to start kind of following your own vision and you can make that work, like you should do it. And you know, the danger, when I say the danger is too early, it just means you don't yet have the knowledge and skills to be able to really do what you want to do in your career, create a kind of sustainable income for yourself, that sort of thing. But I don't know of like a, you know, clear cut test that you can use beyond just kind of developing judgment. But if you're asking the question and you're kind of on the fence about it, my guess is you're too late. So go out and dive in on your own. All right, we got another 2 minutes. Feel free to ask questions. Uh, Let me look at what's going on for me. So, next week we'll be here like usual, but in early October, the weekend of the 10th, so I think the 8th is the Thursday. I'm actually going to be traveling to London. So I have no idea what my schedule is. I'll be doing a lot of events with the Ayn Rand Center UK people. So there'll be plenty of content to consume. Don't know about the show. That's really going to depend. I mean, it almost certainly won't be at the same time since, let's see, 6 p.m. plus 6, that's at midnight to 1 London time. So I imagine I'll somewhat more adjust to the time change even in the few days that I'll be there. But I will let you guys know. In the meantime, that is all for this week. Appreciate all you guys for showing up. Appreciate everybody else who's tuned in. And we will talk next time. As always, the best way to stay in touch is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk soon.